Thank you all for being here, for being on time. This is a pretty big topic, and it's an important topic to have. When we were designing this day in particular, we wanted to do something around that was going to provide some context of what's happening in the country in the last year, particularly around issues of race equity, and especially because we had such a big summer that just kind of thrust it into national discourse and into everyone's conversations. What is happening with Black lives and policing, and how we can all be allies to what should be a cause we all care about, right? And not just allies, but advocates. And well, I've seen the word accomplice pop up. So how do we have conversations about race and race equity and systemic racism and prejudice, and how they're so seeped into our culture? But I wanted to make it more foundational than that. How do we understand our own identities, our own interactions in the world, how we show up in the world, and start from there as a foundation to have these hard conversations? And so I was very pleased to have been introduced in doing the research to Stephanie Page, PhD. She is in the space of STEM equity and community engagement. She has over 15 years as a biological and biochemical academic research experience. And she earned her doctorate in biochemistry and biophysics from the School of Medicine at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which I believe is where you're joining us from, North Carolina. Dr. Page is a proud graduate of North Carolina A&T State University with a bachelor's and master's in chemical engineering and biology, respectively. Throughout her career as a scientist, I love that you're a scientist. Dr. Page has been committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the academy and academics and in STEM. She is a creator of the Black and STEM community, and which has a social media following of nearly 17,000 individuals and organizations. Over the years, she has contributed to several major efforts to improve the scientific workforce and education through experiences such as serving on an NIH's working group for the next generation researchers and for the National Academic Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's report on mentoring in STEM. The additional M stands for medicine. Oh, I love that. In her current role, communications and community engagement for the Advanced Resource and Coordination Network in NSF Advanced Funded STEM Equity Brain Trust, focused on intersectional gender equity in the STEM Academy. I feel smart just reading your bio, so I know you're going to do a great job of walking us through this workshop. I'm really excited for it. I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Diana. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here and to engage with this group. And I just want to say, you mentioned it, and I want to reiterate that intersectionality is a big topic. It's a big conversation, and it can feel overwhelming at times, particularly just from looking at our own self-inspection and looking at our own processes of understanding identity and what it means in the context of oppression and inequity. So I just hope that we can all be patient with ourselves today, take a few deep breaths at different moments. And if you feel comfortable, there will be moments where I ask you in the audience to engage with me a little bit as we are having this discussion about inequity. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, and this is the part that tends to get bumpy with all of this, so please bear with me for a moment. Let's see, can everyone see? Let me just get a couple of confirmations. Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start clicking through, and I'll jump over when it's time for us to engage a little bit deeper. So to start in this conversation about intersectionality, and kind of have this slide that sort of anchors us a little bit to some of the misconceptions about intersectionality. And a really big piece is that intersectionality or intersectional, these are not categories of identities, and they shouldn't be used to describe an individual. Instead, one way to think of intersectionality is as an analytic or a framework for examining how systems of oppression intertwine to influence experiences and opportunities. Intersectionality can also be a framework for developing approaches to address systems of oppression. So for example, in my day job, where we're thinking about how do we advance intersectional gender equity, I'm applying the lens of intersectionality so that we can build within our community and beyond our work, where we're really considering the individual needs, where so many different people have so many different overlapping identities, and we want to ensure that they experience equity too. And intersectionality, as a topic for marginalized folks, it can be overwhelming because we are experiencing oppression in the context of our identity and sense of self, but we also deal with kind of understanding who we are, understanding our identity. This is kind of a lifelong journey when it comes to identity. And so as we work through valuing ourselves and seeing where maybe we have adopted identities that maybe we don't feel are who we are, and so we're pursuing better understanding, it's kind of difficult sometimes to interface with systems of oppression. And all of that overlap is a part of the context for why intersectionality is what it is in terms of just this deep term and this deep framework and this deep analytic. And there are just so many different facets to it. I can't get through much in 45 minutes, but I hope that we can explore enough to give us all a start to both advance my thought processes and give me new things to think about as I'm introducing intersectionality and some of these concepts to you today. I want to start with a little bit of history, and some of you may have heard of Kimberly Crenshaw. She is a Black woman, and she coined the term intersectionality in the late 1980s. And the context was actually the law and whether or not the law is truly objective, particularly as when it comes to oppression of Black women and experiences of Black women in our legal systems. She is a lawyer, she is a civil rights advocate, and she's a scholar of critical race theory, which is really this examination of the law, and particularly in the context of this kind of burgeoning liberalism over the last 30, 40, 50 years. And really, are these approaches transformative in really envisioning or revising the power systems of our legal institutions? Kimberly Crenshaw is a professor at Columbia Law School and UCLA School of Law. And intersectionality, I love this quote, and it's pretty long, so I'm going to sort of slow down as I read it out. But this is from a book called Intersectionality by Patricia Hill Collins and Surma Bill. And it says that intersectionality is a way of understanding and analyzing the complexity in the world, in people, and in human experiences. The events and conditions of social and political life and the self can seldom be understood as shaped by one factor. They are generally shaped by many factors in diverse and mutually influencing ways. When it comes to social inequality, people's lives and the organization of power in a given society are better understood as being shaped by not a single axis of social division, be it race or gender or class, but by many axes that work together and influence each other. Intersectionality as an analytic tool gives people better access to the complexity of the world and of themselves. So we're going to take a moment to both kind of take a deep breath and look at this quote where I've broken it down into 4 sections. And what I'm curious to know for you is what resonates as you kind of see intersectionality here without it being broken down or us going deeper into conversation. But From what you know, from what you've experienced, both directly around intersectionality and the idea of how our identity can in part shape how we experience the world around us. So if you don't mind, read through the different parts of the quote. And if you feel comfortable, please select the number for the part that resonates the most with you and share like maybe 1 or 2 sentences that about how and why you think that resonates with you. And we'll take just a quick moment of silence so everyone can kind of sit with that. Okay. Is anyone interested in sharing their thoughts in the chat? Okay, great. We have a couple of comments that have already come through. So someone said, Isabella said, number 2 resonates because it shows that intersectionality is fluid. There is no one underlying issue. That's great. That's amazing. Any other thoughts? You see a couple of people have said number 1 resonates. Number 1 from Frida, number 1 resonates with me because it adds the humanity and compassion to this concept. Yes, I think that is often overlooked, that intersectionality as a theory sort of came out of what tends to be a lack of recognition of humanity and compassion for certain groups of people. Great answers. So I'll hop back over to the slide and just keep thinking through that. And I've shared the slides just in case you want to continue to look through some of this material after our engagement here today. When we think about intersectionality and we think about particularly the part of the quote that sort of brings to our attention that this isn't just about one axis of in the context of our social identity and our social and factors in the organization of power, I wanted to sort of bring us to a space where we can really look at this from, kind of an illustration, if you will. And this is a small list of factors, and there are so many more to consider in order to examine identity and oppression and privilege, how all of that interacts. But if we look at the thicker purple line where we're showing that this is the axis, or we're representing this as an axis that shows power and dominance, where on one side above the axes is privilege and below is oppression, we can place a couple of factors that we think about in the context of social groups and put those in an orientation where we can see that there's at the very least a spectrum when it comes to that power and dominance. So for example, if you're looking at gender versus race, or even skin tone, so how dark or light you might be, and disability, and also class. And when we look at power and dominance as an axis defining privilege and oppression, we can already see a few dynamics at play. What is it to have a certain racial identity and maybe be darker versus lighter, or to have a certain racial identity and to identify as man versus woman? And intersectionality calls us to understand that how one experiences oppression and privilege is not determined by just one of these factors. We can see where we can build out so many different combinations of overlap with just this small subset. And it also calls us to understand that the many factors come together and influence each other. And one important thing to say here is that sometimes people tend to think of intersectionality as meaning that our identities are additive. So if you put it in an equation and say 1 + 1 + 1, that equals 3. And so how you experience oppression equals 3, where really it is to say that if you have a certain identity and then another overlapping identity and then another overlapping identity, we can't necessarily say that it all just adds together. It influences each other. So you might even see an exponential experience around oppression. And so we can't necessarily assign either a magnitude of oppression, which we tend to do. That really what we want to do is be able to better understand each other and better understand how our systems of power and influence and privilege have impacts on different people. And how do we change those systems? So I wanted to kind of take a step back and talk to you a little bit about social identity, because it's hard sometimes to look at factors in the organization of power in a society and say, well, that's social identity. Well, I think to think of it a little bit deeper is really helpful in the context of intersectionality, because factors in the organization of power often determine and influence the creation of a social group. So what we think a lot about racialized identity in the United States, we can see that there's a clear axis or axes where to be Indigenous or Native American or an Indigenous peoples, to be Black in the United States, given the history of colonialism and imperialism, to given the history of genocide and given the history of chattel slavery, that there have been uniquely defined social groups in order to construct and differentiate and maintain a dominant group. And that social groups, in fact, influence our social identity. And what happens with social identity is that we really do build a self-concept. It's our own self-concept is derived from perceived membership in a relevant social group. And so a lot of this is tied together. And this is where it can sort of feel stressful to sort of say, oh my gosh, I love being Black. There's so much I value about Black cultures. There's so much I value about kind of what it is to be Black and what my experience is in that. But then to also fully understand that there's this deeply ingrained history of oppression, that I continue to experience oppression because of my identity as being Black, and also because really the social group that I am a part of was defined as a part of a white supremacist, colonialist perspective and empowering of certain peoples over others. When we look at my social identity, so I am a Black woman. People, when you look just at numbers and how much money you make and what are your assets, I'm considered to be on the lower end of middle class. In terms of colorism, I am darker skinned. And so I can very clearly show where those aspects of my identity are interacting in a way that place me in a certain position in the balance of power and dominance. But one area that I know specifically where I experience some privilege is that I'm abled. So as I move through the world and I engage in most spaces, I don't necessarily have to think about whether those spaces exclude my participation or exclude my being able to feel safe and move in those spaces in the context of whether or not I have a disability. So I've kind of walked you through a few terms fairly quickly, and we're already over halfway through our time. So I just want to take a moment to pull back out and look a little bit more broadly at intersectionality. And intersectionality in its roots comes out of the Black feminist movement. And it's a term and a theory that was initially applied to the exploration of oppression of Black women. And there were individuals whose work falls under whose frameworks and approaches fall under intersectionality that predated and who influenced intersectionality as a scholarly thought and theory in term itself. Black women's needs were often excluded from racial equality and feminist movements, which really contributed to the existence of Black feminism. And within that, building in frameworks and approaches that allowed us to think uniquely about the oppression of Black women in the context of change and transformation is really a lot of of what inspired intersectionality as a theory. But what happened as time moved on is that some scholars, institutions, and movements actually redefined and continue to redefine and appropriate intersectionality in ways that exclude and oppress Black women and Black feminism itself. And so what we've seen is that scholarship and movements to disrupt the organization of power and to address the oppression of certain groups in our society often have mirrored or reiterated the systems of oppression experienced by Black women while using frameworks that Black women created. And that has led to some really complicated conversations about how we look at intersectionality as it can be applied more broadly, but where and when do we build in the lines and build in kind of the habits of intentionality where we're saying we can expand the use of something without excluding the original or the originators of those processes and scholarships and analytics. So what I want to bring up here is a really great quote from a book that I think so many people should read because it kind of addresses this complex conversation. And this book is called Black Feminism Reimagined After Intersectionality, and it's by Jennifer Nash. And in this book, actually in the end of the book, is one of kind of like a quote that just resonates with me because it deals so much with Black feminism and intersectionality as a product of Black feminism, and how do we look at broader women's studies and women's movements in this relationship. And she said, "I dream of Black feminist theory that puts pressure on women's studies to recognize the utopian world-making work of our still unfolding political dreaming, which includes, but also exceeds intersectionality. My wish is for a Black feminist theory that refuses to perform work for women's studies and that instead compels the field to reckon with its own racially saturated fantasies and attachments. I want this reckoning not to take the form of gratitude, appreciation, or apology, the popular forms that circulate in both popular and academic feminisms, but instead to include a deep historical engagement with the labor that Black women, Black feminists, and Black feminist theories are regularly called upon to perform for women's studies, effectively shoring up women's studies' own claims to virtue." So here we're going to take another one of those pauses for some engagement, where again, I've broken down this quote into 3 different sections. And I know the third one looks bigger, but there was just a lot more nuance in that particular part. And I want to hear like which sections resonate with you most and why. And also think about this in some context that you might be aware of where other feminisms of women of color might have been appropriated or co-opted in a way that we need to think about the broader movement around women's studies and feminism, and what do we do to reckon that and to reconcile that. So I'm going to hop over to peek at the chat and give everyone a quick moment with that piece. So we have a response from Natalie that says, "I resonate with 3. We need to teach, learn about the laborious trials women have gone through." Yes, this is actually an incredible comment for me, because in particular, I think that what is often an experience of women of color and that we see discussed in feminisms of color is the assignment and distribution and recognition of labor and who is owed that labor. And so oftentimes broader feminist movements and even women's studies and the scholarship around it looks to women of color and Black women to really perform this labor of that digging deeply and also of kind of protecting and ensuring the virtuous nature that is assigned to this work. Juliana says, number 3 resonates because we need to learn about the history. And Frida also said that number 3 resonates and that it is because true feminism encompasses more than just gratitude and appreciation. It is going to take a lot more work. And I think here is a great place to point out what it is to have relationship and what about our work and our reckoning shows a shift and a change. And that doesn't necessarily happen at the point of an apology or an expression of gratitude. It happens in sustained work. It happens in our showing that we are going to take up the labor of, in the case of being privileged people or being privileged along a certain axis, that we're going to take up the work of ensuring that we are addressing and modeling the values that we say we hold. Maya, I hope I hope I pronounced that correctly. I hope I haven't mispronounced anyone's name. Says that number 3 also resonates and that it reminds me of performative allyship in social media. It's not just about shouting people out, thanking people. What is the real work that needs to be done? Yes, that is. Yes, I love hearing all of these. And I'm learning from you all too. So I'm going to go back over and we'll pick back up here. And in the next section, I kind of feel like I've been building up to this part, is that intersectionality is also a means for us to examine exclusion, even in the context of those of us who can say, oh, you know, I have this identity where because of overlapping identities, I experience oppression and I experience exclusion, but it calls us to think beyond ourselves and to take a step outside. And I wanted to share this quote from Imani Barbarin, who is a Black disabled woman. And she said, when you're Black and disabled, you're often in between 2 separate marginalized populations that, whether consciously or unconsciously, only marginalize you further. It can be hard to come to the realization that no matter where you go, there are pieces to you that no one will understand and they won't seek to. Your experiences aren't felt by a majority of the disabled community as a Black person, and your disability isn't understood by those in the Black community. You're always hiding a piece of yourself no matter who's around you. This is how ableism and racism is inextricably linked. And this is an incredible example for me to share too, about how these identities influence each other and how the systems of oppression associated with these identities influence each other. And it's not that you can just add one to the other. You really have to look at the unique conditions that are created as a result of someone moving through the world with this set of identities. And because I experience privilege along the axis of disability, I will highlight specific voices rather than articulate the experience in my own words. And what I really encourage you to do is to look more into Imani's work. She has an amazing site called crutchesandspice.com. She also has great resources through her social media. She is both on Twitter and Instagram, and I do believe TikTok, and she does these amazing short informative videos and just critical on the moment thought processes. Her scholarship is amazing. I also wanted to share with you about another activist, Alice Wong. She's an Asian American disability activist, and she has done just some paramount work in the area. She has an incredible book that I always keep beside me, Disability Visibility. She also founded the Disability Visibility Project, and she has an additional collection of essays by disabled people called Resistance and Hope. And I really encourage you to not just look at these as instances of trying to take in and then regurgitate the experience of disabled people, but to really look at this from an intersectional perspective and to really examine not just our own practices, but where and when we need to take the time, stop talking, and give space and hear and look at where our activism in our own areas can exclude disabled folks. So as we come around the corner to kind of round things out, I wanted to share about a person who has been really influential to me personally in my reading and my studying of the scholarship of intersectionality, Gloria Anzaldúa. And she passed away in 2004, and I wished I had encountered her work as she was still living. And I have, but I just wasn't aware of her by name. She is a Chicana cultural theorist and feminist theorist and a poet. And she has this amazing book that she co-edited with Cherry Moraga called This Bridge Called My Back, which includes writings of radical women of color, so many names that we might know, such as Audre Lorde. And really why I introduced Gloria is because along with people like Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde and many others, these are works that included examinations of overlapping identities in different feminisms. So you begin to see kind of analytics and frameworks that built up to what we call intersectionality today through looking at and investigating their work. And I wanted to share Gloria's quote because it really kind of brings together some of those complexities of intersectionality and examinations of ourselves and how we move through the world and kind of that complicated experience. And one quote that just jumps out at me amongst others says that living in a multicultural society, we cross into each other's worlds all the time. We live in each other's pockets, occupy each other's territories, live in close proximity and intimacy with each other at home, school, and work. We are mutually complicitous, us and them, nosotras y los otros, white and colored, straights and queer, Christian and Jew, self and other, oppressor and oppressed. We, all of us, find ourselves in position of being simultaneously both insider and outsider. As you might have expected, for our last exercise, I really wanted to hear how this quote potentially resonates with you, which part seems to jump out at you most, and what are your thoughts about how it resonates with you and kind of what is it speaking to within you? So I'm going to hop back over again and peek at the chat. And please, this is, you know, in the 35 minutes we've been speaking already, this is a lot to take in and digest. So please continue to kind of take a deep breath and sort of search where you are mentally and emotionally as we engage with this topic. Frida has shared that number 3 resonates because in some sense it allows us to walk in each other's shoes, to understand that we are both insiders and outsiders. Yes, I think, you know, there's so much to this quote and even in this book that this quote comes from. But what's particularly interesting for me that I think can often be overlooked is what are the shared experiences, particularly when we take into account different oppressed and marginalized peoples. And so when I say words like assimilation and acquiescence, so, you know, kind of moving through the world and as we pursue, whether it's our education, whether it's our careers, do we feel like we can move through those spaces in our full selves? Do we feel like our needs are being taken into account. And this is actually a really critical thought around inequity. When people talk about inclusion, what does that really mean? Is it just kind of a trendy word, or are we really dealing with the ways in which our spaces and environments do not allow all of us to thrive, and particularly in the context of bringing our whole selves? Natalie shared that number 2 resonates with her because we are all responsible and we are all connected. Laura shares that number 2 resonates because I feel like it resonates with everyone and how we really all connect with something, whether it be anything. It's a great one. Diana shared number 3. I think it makes you recognizant in the ways you are privileged and the ways you are not, and how that can be used to bring other people in. I actually love this. This was a point that I was going to make because we're looking at so many different axes. There's so much to consider. But what we often have to ask ourselves as we move through different spaces is, who is more vulnerable than I am in this particular space, in this particular moment? And if we call ourselves activists and we call ourselves pursuant of equity, then sometimes those of us who are doing the work have to kind of take a step back. As I mentioned in the context of Imani's quote, and where have Black feminism or Black racial equity movements left out disabled people, or not included disabled people? And it's not universal, but there have been times and spaces and cases where it has. And we've even seen that in some of the movement around racial equity during the pandemic, as we saw that Black, Indigenous, and Latinx groups and communities were both experiencing more severe disease and experiencing mortality, and just transmission was just higher in general in these communities, where we know there's a lot of inequity around healthcare, around resources that would keep our community safe. But what was often left out of the discussion is, what was it to have had those identities, those histories, and be disabled? And so what would the most vulnerable people need? Natalie shares that ignorance can be harmful. So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get our time to both really deeply engage, and I just not talk to you, but we talk to each other. So I want to just share the last couple of slides, and Diana's going to start taking questions. So please go ahead and start dropping those in the chat. So I wanted to share a little bit about going deeper, and I made my little, what looked just way worse than this one, my representation of the different axes of privilege and oppression as it relates to power and dominance. And I wanted to highlight that there's so much more to look at. And this figure is just a representation. And this is from work by Catherine Polly Morgan. And I do encourage you to think about it, because it's such a critical conversation, particularly in the context of her work around educational equity. But as you can see, there's so many different axes. There's so much to consider, and it can all be overlapping and influencing each other at any given point in time, and how we interface in the world and interface with people of different identities and think about how we apply intersectionality. It's really important to take all of this into account. I encourage you to continue to explore the work of the scholars that I shared today. And I do want to say a couple of other names that I think would be great for you to continue to look into. Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Cherry Moraga, Sandra Soto, and Saidiya Hartman are just, they've been so profoundly impactful for me very recently. I'm very excited to show off this book, which I think is just an amazing example of some of what we talked about today. This is The Disordered Cosmos by my friend, Dr. Chanda Prescott Weinstein, and she is amazing. She is a cosmologist, but she actually also deals very deeply with Black feminism and gender and women's studies, and she's just an incredible person. And this book is just such a great it's just such a great both resource and just experience to approach with an identity where you can really apply the intersectional lenses and examining who you are and your path in so many of the different spaces that she discusses here. I also encourage you to look at Race on the Brain by Jonathan Cahn. We really didn't have time to get into it today, which is sort of the difference between social constructs and biological constructs. And one really major idea that I like to disrupt is that race is not genetic, it's not biological, it is in fact social. Gender is in fact social. And even sex, so biological sex, is non-binary. It's not just male and female. There's actually a spectrum to that. I also encourage you to look at fictional works that, and here I'm giving examples that are explorations of Black womanhood, but really as you begin to look more deeply into intersectionality and exploring what that looks like and how that's experienced and how those stories are told through different identity lenses, I encourage you personally to just look also at fictional works from people who are representative of different identities. For me, I encourage you as a Black woman to look at and read Toni Morrison, Zora Neale Hurston, Julie Dash as a filmmaker, and just more contemporary creators. I think that it's just an important part of the experience to both look at the creative work in the fictional space as much as we look at the scholarship. It's just important that both of these pieces are done together. And I just would like to acknowledge my team at the ARC Network, and particularly Dr. Heather Metcalf and Noelia Sanchez, who were just really instrumental and helpful in my putting this together today and being with you today. And then also a group of my scientist colleagues, and we have so many different conversations about intersectionality, and that includes Drs. Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, Rachel Burks, Danielle Lee, and Caleb Wilson, and just the broader Black and STEM community, which really exposed me a lot to thinking about intersectionality in the context of equity in STEM. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. This was so good. This was so good. I'm going to ask if you can share the book again, because, for my own personal reading, I'd love to see that.
I'm happy to say it just came out this week. And I will drop, if you don't mind my kind of looking like my eyes are going somewhere, I will drop a link in the chat, because I think Chanda has a couple of more virtual book tour stops. And and so some of the people who are hosting her are actually scholars that apply intersectionality, and it is an amazing piece of work. And yeah, I totally encourage you. And what I think is phenomenal is that we don't, and it's kind of a new thing for us to be able to hear from Black women scientists, or Black women or women of color who are advancing in different fields that have historically excluded us, to hear from their own words what that is like, but then to also bring in these ideas of like, what are our feminisms, and what are the theories that we apply as we look at both transforming these spaces and making it better for people coming behind us, but also kind of reconciling what we've experienced. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to start looking at the questions. I know we have one here, but if you have any other questions, ladies, please drop them in. And we have one from Frida Mendez Arce, and her question is, as an advocate, how do you uplift other intersectionalities or identities without falling into a savior complex?
Savior complex is difficult to avoid in our society, because it's kind of I think there's just something in our power structure that says, people need to be saved as opposed to systems need to be fixed. And at each and every step, it is a personal reflection of mine, because to operate as the savior, you have to imagine that you're limiting how much the person who is marginalized in a context where you're doing your work, they can't be but so empowered if you have to be the savior at the end. And if at the end of the story, you have to be the savior, then the work and the activism is actually about you and not about them. And, for me, I do reflect on and have to stay true to and remembering what my experiences are, where people treated me with, and where I was exposed to other people's savior complexes. How did that feel? And did that really allow me to feel as though and experience being empowered and experiencing more equity in my space, or did it actually oppress me even more? And that's another thing we tend not to think about, is that the savior complex, it reiterates oppression, because really it's contextualizing someone and placing them in a role where their oppression is supposed to be used to elevate you. So it's important to be reflective. It's important to be quiet, and to and to listen to criticism. Sometimes it's important to just be quiet and see if something needs to be said, because you can't always hear if you're always talking. Or if you're always kind of in motion and you're not stopping. And I think that it's important to really understand that it is difficult to be oppressed and to move through the world as a marginalized, someone who comes from different marginalized spaces and identities. But we have to kind of think about what we want to model. What's the value system? And that value system can sometimes mean like displacing ourselves and displacing our power in the moment, so that really the most vulnerable can speak and can be heard, and that we can follow their lead. So, it's, I say, you have to be patient with yourself also. You have to know that you won't get it right. But I think going back to that quote, you also have to be ready to do more than apologize or acknowledge that you have to actually do labor, and you have to do the work of understanding those who are less privileged relative to yourself.
Absolutely. So I think the next question actually falls in line with what you've already said, about how do you recognize that you are, I guess, perpetuating this like white savior complex. And it just made me think, I think you've answered it, but it made me think about in terms of policy. We tried to always, and I know a lot of the young women here with us today are interested in that policy space. We always talk about like what perspective is missing when you're talking about laws. And I think it has to go further, right? It has to go like not just what perspective is missing, but what voice isn't at the table. It's not about us speaking for other communities. It's about making sure that they have a seat at the table. And so I'm pretty aware of how that works in the policy world, but how does that work when you're trying to build that intersectionality and that diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workforce, and specifically in the STEM space, because that's where you're in?
Yeah. No, everything you said is spot on. And I think too, I feel like one of the fallouts, I'd say, or one of the sort of residual effects of kind of how power systems work is that there's like, it's almost like the analogy about the pie, where you have so many marginalized groups, and they're being given one tiny little slice of this really big pie, and being told you have to split that up, and whatever that is, it could be that the pie is an entire table, and you're giving out one seat. And so I think it's about looking at your approaches, and it's about looking at where you have space and opportunity to scooch over and maybe make that pie slice wider. Where do you have opportunities where it's just necessary to say, I'm going to you're giving me this seat, I'm going to give it to someone else. Sometimes it's kind of, you mentioned the word accomplice, and sometimes it's kind of like it's having an accomplice that gets a bigger piece of the pie, and knowing that you're going to come into the room with someone and bring someone with you, and knowing that that accomplice is going to say, okay, now, Stephanie's brought someone with another perspective and a necessary perspective, and Stephanie and I have been talking. I'm going to get up so that that other person has my seat. And so it really is, it's planning and it's plotting. But it's also kind of confronting. There are times when you have to confront the system itself and say, okay, you have me in this room. You very rarely have Black women in this room. I get it. I appreciate it. I'm thankful. But look around and tell me who else is missing. And sometimes it's making really uncomfortable statements to people and saying, I'm staring at white men. And I'm staring at 10 white men. You could have brought 2 in here, and you could have given up the rest of those seats and the rest of those spaces for other people to be heard. And so it really is, it's an interesting kind of position to be in. And it's a whole nother conversation when it comes to intersectionality, right? Because it is, sometimes you have to kind of tell people in power to confront where they're still maintaining their power and comfort in these spaces. And so, it's such a deep, long conversation, but I think it's still always important to kind of look left and look right and say, I can't speak to everyone who would be impacted by the decisions being made here today. And it's problematic that you've only brought me here. And, there have even been times where I have had to speak very openly about the fact that even as a Black woman and just the magnitude of how we express ourselves, how we move, how we dress, how we talk, how we walk, that I'm palatable. I'm palatable to most spaces and systems of power. And so sometimes it's saying too, I know there's a reason I'm in this room versus another Black woman. And it's also kind of looking at where people are picking and choosing, and holding that up to them and saying, you're actually choosing to ignore Indigenous peoples and Native American peoples in this policy or in this space, in this decision. You're choosing to ignore disabled people. You do see that happen. So it's, there's no one-off answer. I think kind of like what you said, it's going situation by situation. It's looking at, who your accomplices are. It's working together. It's communicating. It is plotting too. It's plotting, like, how do we stretch out and make space? Anyone who has siblings, I know people have different experiences growing up with siblings, but for me personally, the picture that comes to mind is like all 3 of us are going to get in this one chair and we're going to squeeze in. And, like I was one of 4. So it would be like the 3 of the smaller of us squeezing in on the chair, because we're going to sit down. We're going to be at the table. And it might be that the biggest one is standing up and is going to stand up and be at the table, but we're going to be here. And so it's kind of like, how do we work together to make that happen? And sometimes too, it is redefining where the table is. And sometimes that is very difficult, but sometimes it's also possible.
Yeah. I have 3 siblings myself, and they're all boys. So I know making sure that space is made. Okay, we have another question from Frida. And I think this question made me think about sometimes the internal struggle of giving up, of like battling within ourselves of that privilege that we have. I think for me, obviously I'm pretty light-skinned Latina, and my experience is very different from somebody who might be of a darker skin tone. One thing that always comes to mind is, for whatever reason, whenever I walk through metal detectors, they always go off. And I remember one time I was at the airport, and the TSA guy said, "Oh, you're fine. You don't look threatening." And
Mhm.
that always comes back to me, like, what is it about me that doesn't look threatening? And, that kind of just made me dissect my own identity and my own privileges of how I show up in the world. But anyways, Frida had a question, and it's, how do you work under these same systems of oppression while simultaneously working towards change to bring in those identities that are missing? So I think you went through,
Ooh,
but
yeah.
maybe some action items for these ladies as they're kind of entering that workforce, right?
Yeah. I think that this is where it's really important to to talk a little bit about like the acknowledgement slide and why it's there. Because I think I'm hearing both in the question of kind of like, how do I take care of me as I do this work? I'm doing work in systems that where I experienced oppression, where I've experienced abuse, and where I've experienced really just awful, terrible behavior on so many different levels and axes, but I'm committed to change. And, I think it kind of has a lot to do with a question that I feel like can be common, especially as I'm looking at feminisms of different women of color and different films of color, and looking at the scholarship, particularly, I mean, when I say Gloria Anzaldúa, I was just doing a little bit of reading in prep, and I remember having to take a moment yesterday because I was just weeping at some of the reading that I was revisiting of hers. And I think it's really understanding what you need in order to thrive. It's important that you value yourself as an intact person. I mean, that's another thing that we really should model. It's like, how do we both be conscious of others, but how do we also kind of model what are the steps that we take to take care of ourselves? And something that I often say to my friends is that, like, we need you to be intact. We need you to be good, because if you're not good, then the work that you're doing and what you're contributing, that we lose that. And part of the reason that it's valuable is because of who you are and because you exist. And so it's just understanding that. And there's so many different layers. For me, it looks like therapy. For me, it looks like having time with these people who understand, like, we work together and we understand this work together. It's kind of like just being in fellowship and being in community with them. And then it's still too is kind of allowing those moments where it can be difficult. It's not a common practice in our country, and it's not necessarily associated with capitalistic societies. I mean, literally, as a psychological study of capitalistic societies, we're not taught to kind of say, this isn't about me right now. This is about, this is about the most vulnerable people. And so sometimes the discussion is about me, and sometimes it just isn't. And so how do we, or the activism, sorry, how do we kind of bring ourselves to a space of being able to step back? And so a lot of what I think we really kind of need to do is look at it as if it's all it all comes together. So both the taking care of ourselves and understanding what we need in order to thrive, it makes us better at understanding and standing behind and standing up for other people and really working against disrupting oppressive systems. I hope that answers your question. And, yeah.
I thank you so much. I think I would concur. I think those small little disruptions can lead to some significant change in the long run. And if we know anything about, if we've learned anything in the last year, is that absolutely there are some opportunities for us to be better and to show up for those that have least among us. Which I know has been hard, even with something as simple as wearing a mask. That inability of seeing outside of ourselves. But I want to commend everyone for being here and taking that first step. But thank you so much, Stephanie, for being with us today and putting this presentation together.
Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to engaging with you all in the future.
Thanks. Bye.